Hey, everybody, welcome back to Engaging the Phenomenon. And today we are honored to have on two very special guests. George Knapp, investigative journalist. He, broke the whole story on Area 51. He's been at this like 30 or so years. And Colm Kelleher, which I think people don't deeply appreciate how involved he is in this subject. Hopefully we'll get into some of that, and it'll be apparent. He was associated with Bigelow. He worked on NIDS. He did, and it was what we're going to talk about here, part of AAWSAP. He was on the Bigelow side. He was the project manager for AAWSAP. So on the contractor end, so they just came out with a book which I recommend everybody get. Inside the U.S. government covert UFO program, initial revelations, and that is talking about AAWSAP. So again, it's really an honor to have both of you guys on. I appreciate your time. And I guess, Colm, let's start with you. What is your, why did you write this book?
Well, I guess the main reason was that the previous book, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, did not really fully, I think, inform people out there of the complete scope of AAWSAP. AAWSAP, which was the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Application Program, DIA program that ran between 2008 and 2010. Skinwalkers at the Pentagon focused on only one of the arms of the AAWSAP study, which was it focused on the effects of UFOs on people, which was, a litany of medical injury cases, physiological effects, psychological effects. And, we followed the data down some rabbit holes in actually looking into people's reported paranormal effects as a result of having a UFO close encounter. So, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon really covered the effects of UFOs on humans. In order to balance the equation, quote unquote, the second arm of the AAWSAP program was really focused on the UFO performance part of this whole thing. And it was an attempt to explain to readers that one of the central sort of arms of AAWSAP was called Project Physics. Project Physics was initiated in order to essentially track a baseline on what the best thinkers in the theoretical and practical physics arena could come up with in terms of forecasting what UFO performance, what human aircraft performance would look like 40 years out in the future. So 38 sort of the best minds around that could be contracted on a short-term basis were hired by AAWSAP to write these essentially white papers on what the future aircraft would look like, what kind of future propulsion systems would look like, power generation systems. Would traversable wormholes become a sort of a commonly used method of faster than light propulsion? Those kinds of questions were addressed in Project Physics. And the object of Project Physics was simply to translate that and hopefully marry that with the observables of UFO performance that had been part of the AAWSAP program, but also in the literature for 75 years. So, the idea being, how close was the delta between forecasts 50 years from now versus theoretical physics, applied physics, and ultimately engineering. So, Project Physics was to construct a baseline. So we felt that the book was a really good counterbalance to the description of UFO effects on people. And, this is just plain nuts and bolts characteristics of UFOs, and an attempt to marry it to physics and engineering.
And George, you're an investigative journalist. What's kind of your thinking behind putting out this book?
Colm mentioned the nuts and bolts angle that's covered in this book. I jokingly suggested that as a possible subtitle for the book. And then we rethought it and thought the word nuts in a UFO book might not be a good idea. But really, this is supposedly what the UFO public wants: hardcore data about UFO performance characteristics, as seen through the viewpoint of physics and engineering. We have, the AAWSAP program was a UFO program. It is a model of what a UFO program should be. People kind of forget about it. It gets mixed into the national dialogue with ATIP, and there's a lot of confusion about that. But this was a big, robust, definitive program that looked at hardcore issues about how UFOs fly, how they do what they do. This book, the real strength of it is it goes into the files, it digs out the cases, it demonstrates the physical characteristics of UFOs in very well documented cases and incidents where they would set down, how they show lift and propulsion, how these things presumably work. It's the kind of data that the UFO world is always demanding that it wants. Here it is. And these are cases, a lot of them are older cases taken from the files, so there's no confusion about whether or not these are Chinese drones. AAWSAP, as Jim Lakatsky said in the very first public statement, first interview I ever did, this was a UFO program. It looked at a lot of broader topics associated with UFOs, but first and foremost, it looked at flying saucers, unknown craft, UAP, how they do what they can do. And we got a lot of great data in this book. I think it's a treasure trove for people who are serious about trying to figure out how these things fly, how they do what they do. And I hope people check it out.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that here with this book, and the former book, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, you have authored books by the people that were running the program. They were running the UFO program, and they're telling the public, look, this is what we did. This is, some of what we're able to share about it. So, I mean, I don't think people have even, I think it goes over most people's heads. You got the Jim Lakatsky, who was the project manager on the DIA end and the project manager on the BAASS contractor end column, are telling you, this is what we studied, regarding the UFO phenomenon. And, not only were we looking at the nuts and bolts, because in the UFO field, we have both nuts and bolts, right? No, but you couldn't really separate the paranormal effects, right? That it was kind of inclusive in the whole thing. So, in that regard, how did it come to be that you're looking at the nuts and bolts UFO stuff, the hard data, and the whole aspect of, what we can call the paranormal gets into the picture?
Well, I think the simplest answer to your question is rule number one that AAWSAP followed was follow the data. So, we had many discussions between the Washington, D.C. branch that Jim Lakatsky and colleagues were running, and then the Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, which was Robert Bigelow's organization that was formed in order to execute the AAWSAP program. And we had a lot of really good thinkers in the Las Vegas arena, people like Hal Puthoff, Jacques Vallée, Robert Bigelow, all contributed to this whole idea that moving forward with a study on UFOs needed to be all-inclusive. And that is that you follow the scientific directive. You do not throw data into the garbage just because some bureaucrat at the Pentagon or some bureaucrat at USDI decides that this is not the remit of the Department of Defense. So we decided from the get-go to follow the data down whatever rabbit hole it took. And, when we started this program, we did not really anticipate going deep into the paranormal phenomena. We were from the get-go looking at, characteristics of UFOs like lift and propulsion, power generation, spatial temporal translation, human effects. Even directed energy weapons was one of the characteristics of UFOs that we were tasked to look at. So we started out that this was an unambiguous UFO program, but we also started out with the intent to accumulate all of the data and do not sweep any of the data under the carpet. Don't put any of the data into the garbage can. And we wrote over 100 reports that we submitted to Defense Intelligence Agency, and some of those reports did focus on aspects of the paranormal as they pertain to UFO effects on humans. So, as George said, the second book, this Initial Revelations book, is all about the physics and the engineering of the UFOs, which is the counterbalance to the study and the reporting on UFOs on people.
I'll add this, James, is that you can't separate the two. You can't separate UFOs from paranormal. It might be convenient to do that. And I know that the kinds of cases that we explored in the first book, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, make people uncomfortable. How do you think Colm Kelleher, Hal Puthoff, Eric Davis, all of them with PhDs attached to their names, how do you think they feel about investigating what seems like poltergeist type effects associated with UFOs or cryptid creatures? They're not crazy about that. That's not a career builder. It's not something you are comfortable with, but you have to follow the evidence where it leads. And the fact is that stuff has always been associated with UFOs. Ufologists don't like it. We don't like to mix in woo with our flying saucers. We want them to be pristine in their own category. These are craft from another planet and they're visiting us and that's it. Well, that's not how it works. And you are never going to solve this mystery by merely looking at lights in the sky and radar returns. You have to go talk to the people who have the close encounters. You have to have the information and evidence from those who are affected by these encounters. That's what these guys did. It takes guts to do it, to follow the evidence where it leads. But gosh, you can't make a judgment going into a program like AAWSAP and say, yeah, we're just going to discard anything that's too weird because we don't want to upset people at the Pentagon, or we want to skew the results so people will take us more seriously. You follow the evidence where it leads. And it led to some weird stuff. We're not ashamed about that. We're glad that it got as much attention as it did. And we're glad it makes people uncomfortable because the topic is uncomfortable.
Yeah, and I can attest to that firsthand because I've had many encounters, I've had the experiences, and I've tried to trace that back with like a level-headed approach and try to detach myself from it and not believe and even maybe say what the UFO phenomenon is trying to push on any kind of experiencer, right? Because there's a whole perception management, not just from let's say the US government side, but also from the phenomenon side, right? There's narratives that are interwoven into some of these experiences. Did you guys encounter any of that in AAWSAP at all?
You're talking about narratives being woven into the UFO experience in terms of manipulation of perception. If that is the case, we certainly did encounter that. We had one classic case of where we had a number of Defense Intelligence Agency people who had been deployed to Skinwalker Ranch for the purposes of corroborating, all of these reports that were out there, and the DIA people were saying, are these people making this stuff up? We need to go to the property, do a field research project, and find out whether or not this is just being sort of somebody's fantasy. So the number of people over the course of the project were deployed on the ranch. So on one such occasion, we had about 5 or 6 people, among whom were the DIA people, on the property. They all were equipped with Generation 3 night vision binoculars. So suddenly, and this was like at night, so suddenly from behind Skinwalker Ridge, which is the northern border of the property, this really bright light popped up from behind the ridge. So everybody saw it, and everybody was equipped with Generation 3 night vision binoculars. So the first thing they did was everybody, activated the binoculars and started looking at this object. So we had a debriefing session afterwards, and it turned out that every single person looking through the night vision binoculars at this object saw something different. They were reporting something different. Some people reported like a large square object. Some people reported circular object, triangular object. So everybody reported something different. So, people who did not have night vision binoculars were looking at just a light that popped up from behind Skinwalker Ridge. And then we have a constant, exactly the same type of equipment was being used by each person, basic light amplification technology. So they all saw something different. One of the hypotheses we had was that everybody saw something different because everybody was meant to see something different. And so, it could be that some kind of management of perception was going on during that particular incident.
I'd add this, James. The first book that Colm and I worked on was about the ranch, Hunt for the Skinwalker. Skinwalker is sort of the blanket term. It's kind of a metaphor that the Native Americans used to explain all the strange phenomena they had seen on that property and in that Uinta Basin for decades, maybe centuries. It takes on different forms. It's never quite the same in two different instances. And that's sort of a metaphor for the UFO mystery as well. These things change shapes. I mean, why do we have 500 different kinds of flying saucers, different models? Do they really have the variety pack coming here, or did they change shapes? We know there are cases where they're one big object that splits into multiple objects, or they fuse back together. They change shapes. They disappear before our eyes. They give us glimpses of what they allow us to see, but we really have no idea what they genuinely look like. They are shapeshifters. Both the craft that change shapes and the beings that have been reported, there is a perception management on the part of whatever this non-human intelligence is, and we don't understand it yet, but it's pretty clear it takes on whatever form it feels like showing us.
Yeah, and a colleague of mine, Dr. Joseph Burks, came up with something called the virtual experience model, and he was a medical doctor, and he had proposed different levels of this model. One being, potentially holographic technology being implemented by the phenomenon so that a collective group could see it, but also the phenomenon potentially accessing people's central nervous system and inputting whatever information to make them perceive whatever it may be. And one such encounter I had during contact work out in the field was that I had in broad daylight seen a scintillating ruby orb in the sky. Even in the sky, it was scintillating and sparkling. But my partner there with me was sure that what she saw, and she drew it out, was a perfect triangle. But we both see the red object there, and to me, it was as clear as day that it was a sphere. It was an orb. There's no question. But so that's something I've experienced directly, and and a lot of people that have been out in the field have reported similar things. Somebody, will report, that there's something there, but the report of what it is a little bit different. I want to shift a little bit. For AAWSAP, you guys had several projects there, Project Database, Project Physics, Project Engagement, Project Northern Tier, Project Kelleher, Project Ranch, and Project Consciousness. So I want to package them very briefly. So in maybe a sentence or two, can you outline each project, and I'll prompt it. So Colm, Project Database.
Well, Project Database was Jacques Vallée's brainchild, which was the Capella structure of the data warehouse that AAWSAP employed. And ultimately, it resulted in 11 separate databases that were under the rubric of the data warehouse. But the key here was that the dual nature of the UFO phenomenon was captured and baked into that database. So there were database cells for psychological effects. There were database structures that would incorporate paranormal effects. So we didn't have to re-engineer anything. The database was already structured in such a way as to capture pretty well everything associated with UAP performance, as well as effects of UFOs on humans. I'm using UAP and UFO interchangeably. I prefer the term UFO personally.
Okay, and Project Physics.
But Project Physics was the determination to establish a baseline, a real baseline in UFO performance in terms of what the best minds could actually project outwards 40 to 50 years from now. Everything from what the cockpit of the future would look like, are traversable wormholes going to be possible 40 to 50 years in terms of faster than light travel, kind of like a version of what Paul Hill's NASA program looked like in his book, on steroids and multiplied out to 40 or 50 years from now. It was basically the formation of a baseline against which UFO observable performance could be matched.
And that sounds...
Part of that, James, too, was the DIRDs, the 38 DIRDs that were produced, that were put up on JWICS. That was the first real project that AAWSAP did. They were to establish a baseline in all those different categories that Colm was mentioning, and they were really well received when they came out. I remember releasing about a dozen of them in 2018, which is really and the other DIRDs came flooding out after that, but it's really the only documents produced by AAWSAP that have been made public. Those other 100+ page reports that Colm was referencing, no one has seen a page of those, not one page. DIA gets requests, FOIA requests every day, and every day they have to say, we don't have them. I think they probably haven't found them yet, but they're there. They're real.
Right. And, that kind of approach, the 40, 50 years out, sounds almost like a DARPA, right? Like something DARPA would be interested in, their advanced technology.
DARPA were one of the readers on JWICS when the DIRDs, as George said, were first published on JWICS, which is the TSSCI classified internet version that DoD has. Well, DARPA was one of the readers who were very, very interested in what these DIRDs were talking about, because, believe it or not, the production of these kinds of very, very technical projection white papers is a very rare phenomenon these days in the Pentagon litany of projects. It's pretty rare to produce these defense intelligence research documents, and they were extremely well received. It's kind of like ironic that the DIRDs were so well received on JWICS, but then when they reached the public, they were absolutely annihilated in terms of these are flaky sort of, off the wall sort of stuff. And, it's kind of an instructive lesson, the contrast between the two versions of how they were received.
Right. But, I'm glad George was able to report on it and put those out. I remember when he released them to the public, and then eventually, more of them did come out. So then we have Project Engagement.
Project Engagement was one of the initial projects that were thought about regarding capturing historical aspects of the UFO phenomenon from oral histories. Also, there was an attempt, or there was a thought about reaching out to various levels of academia regarding studying the UFO topic. So it was kind of like a multi-layered version of reaching out to academia and research organizations.
Okay, and Project Northern Tier.
Northern Tier was the set of Air Force bases that traversed the 49th parallel. So things like Loring Air Force Base in Maine, Wordsmith Air Force Base, Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota, Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. All of these Northern Tier bases were ringed across the 49th parallel in order to detect incoming Soviet missiles over the North Pole, but they also had intercontinental ballistic missiles. And during the 1970s, 1960s, and 1980s, they were besieged by a whole bunch of different UFO phenomena. So Project Northern Tier was attempted to actually create a database with all of the people who were on those Air Force bases at the time, to separately interview them and to construct a much more detailed, viewpoint of how many UFO incursions there were onto these Air Force bases. Because bottom line, these were national security implications that were happening. The second part of the Northern Tier was we had a long interview with Colonel Barry Hennessy, who was the legendary head of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. We had a long interview with him regarding the Project Northern Tier. And, he told us that a lot of the UFO incursions into these Air Force bases were actually penetration detection operations that were orchestrated by Air Force Office of Special Investigations to detect how well the Air Force, the United States Air Force, was in dealing with incursions into Air Force bases. But he said about 50% of the UFO activity that were detected at the time, they had no idea who they were. So they were not generated from AAWSAP. They were not generated from the United States military. They were, quote unquote, unknown. So, Project Northern Tier was a sort of a full project aimed at delineating the national security implications of the UFO phenomena during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s.
And you have Project Kelleher.
Well, Kelleher was one of these sort of, outlier programs, because Project Kelleher was a study of a set of UFO encounters that had occurred on Kelleher Island, off the coast of northeastern Brazil during the 1970s. And the reason that they were of interest to AAWSAP and BAASS were that a lot of people got injured, some people got killed, and there was definite evidence of UFOs attacking people, hunting people, burning people, causing extreme medical injuries as well as deaths. And this series of events was pretty well documented by the Brazilian Air Force intelligence when they deployed several people in the location of Kelleher Island. So, cut a long story short, AAWSAP BAASS deployed a couple of teams to Brazil during the AAWSAP program. One team went to northeastern Brazil and actually investigated a current series of events, but the other team went to Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, and they interacted with some of the high-level officials that had to do with, the UFO incursions. And actually, that initiative did trigger a set of new documents that were released by the Brazilian government. So Project Kelleher was an outlier study of how UFOs were a threat, could be construed as a national security threat. But, we have no real evidence on mainland USA or in Europe of UFOs causing the kind of intentional injury on people that the UFOs in Kelleher caused.
I think Colaris is a great example of what a UFO investigation should be, James. You know, unlike Arrow, which just seems to be designed to explain stuff away on the shakiest of grounds, these guys get boots on the ground. They send investigators to the scene. They tracked down people who knew what they were talking about. They connected to the Brazilian government. They got those files and a lot more. And again, the frustration for us and for the UFO public should be there's a great big pile of information, much of which has never been seen about these very dramatic cases. These are not your friendly space brethren here to help the Earthlings. They're there hunting Earthlings, causing harm. It is an aberration in the history of the UFO phenomena, but it's an important one. These guys gathered that information. They were on the scene. They put it all into a giant database, and the public has not seen all the information that they gathered because it's all bottled up somewhere back in Washington, D.C.
So, I mean, during the Project Colaris, were they able to collect DNA and medical records and the medical effects?
No, at least we were not able to collect DNA from Colaris victims.
Because foreign,
but
yeah.
We don't know what kind of samples were collected because they have never been made public. We had many attempts to nail down the physician on Colaris Island who did a lot of blood sampling and who was sort of in the thick of this UFO wave. She was handling a lot of the injuries in the medical facility on Colaris Island, which, by the way, was an extremely poverty-stricken area of northern Brazil with not a lot of facilities. And it turned out during this UFO wave, a lot of the top officials, including the mayor, abandoned Colaris Island. So this doctor was kind of left on the island as sort of one of the main people left. And, you know, she did a great job, but it was very difficult to track her down. So if there were any samples taken, it would have been under those auspices.
And I don't want to paint anything one way or the other. It's just a piece of information that I want to put into this equation. Is that in Jacques Vallée, Forbidden Science Volume 4, he talks about a document that he recovered. He said he secured a document talking about the CIA staging UFO events in Brazil and Argentina. And this is about the same time period. So twofold. Could any of that been at play? Number one. Number two, have Colm, you or George have seen that document that Jacques Vallée is referring to?
I have not seen that document.
Me neither.
Okay.
Colm, do you think it's an explanation for Colaris?
At least it doesn't not an either or, right? It could be a part of what was going on.
You know, I have no idea without seeing the document and what it actually says. It's very difficult to evaluate. I haven't seen the document.
So I mean, let me rephrase the question for saying, is it possible that some of what was happening in Colaris advanced human covert technology?
Possible? I guess so. I guess it could be possible.
Because it seems sometimes that Kit is going back and forth, and Kit will, you know, you'll hear about a statement he made. I know he doesn't like people to take what he said and construe it, but you know, it's relevant data and it's out there. So I know sometimes he'll lean in and you know say, you know, this is black program technology.
Well, if it was the CIA, somebody should go to jail for it.
Right, right.
Those injuries were real, you know,
and using UFOs as a cover to do so.
Yeah. So those injuries were real. People were hurt. Someone should pay for it if that was a U.S. government operation.
Yeah, and you know what? I mean, I'm not trying to say either or that it's that is the case. I'm interested in Jacques' findings, and also the statement that he made on Jeffrey Mishlove, talking about similar instances where it seems that the UFO encounter in some cases, that by far not all, just in some cases, that it seemed that the encounters were hoaxed not on the part of the witness, but by somebody who had the resources to do so. So,
well, if we're wondering, does the CIA ever use the UFO mythology and muddled mess Have they used it for their own ends? The answer is yeah. They've taken advantage of it in several different ways and have sown confusion on purpose to hide something else that they're doing. Yeah, that's happened.
And test yeah, like maybe advanced psychotronics and what have you, maybe.
Well, I think we had direct confirmation of that from Colonel Barry Hennessy. I mean, he was really upfront in saying that it was pretty routine for Air Force Office of Special Investigations to utilize the UFO phenomenon in order to cover some of these special access programs, advanced technology that the Air Force was using. And he said, that went back to the 50s, 60s, 70s. It was a very convenient way of clouding the issue. And so, a long time ago, we were talking about these levels of deception regarding the United States government, and a second to completely separate level of deception that was associated with the UFO phenomenon. And it's one of the reasons why I've always thought that we have not made an awful lot of progress in the last 76 years since Kenneth Arnold first reported UFOs in June of 1947, because there are deceptive actors at work in the UFO field that cloud the issue. My background is in immunology and biochemistry, and I'm used to setting up controlled experiments where all the variables are controlled. And once you ask the question in a particular way, you do get an answer. That is not the case in the UFO field, where all of the variables are being manipulated all the time, and that the average sort of attempt to gain information in the UFO field is through the lens of a double layer of deception, one from the phenomenon and one from the United States government. So it does not make research in the UFO field particularly easy.
An example is the cattle mutilations, James. Colm has wrote a whole book about it, that there is a legitimate mystery there. Cattle mutilations undergoing, these cows carved up, 10,000 or so cases. No one has ever been caught. It's not cults. It's not coyotes. It's a very sophisticated sort of biological sampling operation, tracking something through our food chain. That there's a legitimate mystery there, conducted by persons or people or vehicles unknown. And then there's another layer of that where it's humans that are doing it. Colm documented it, that there are humans who are sort of masking themselves under the umbrella of UFOs, knowing that because it's so weird, nobody's ever going to investigate it, but they're all too human doing the very same thing.
Yeah. And, something else I wanted to touch on was, this is a complete segue, is, Jim Lukatsky dropped a bomb in the book. Chapter 9 has, he's talking about a briefing that's taking place of, saying that the U.S. government has not only obtained intact UFO craft off-world vehicle, but has gained access to the inside. So can you speak to that any bit, Colm?
I can speak to that in that the words that Jim Lukatsky wrote are 100% accurate, and the manuscript was submitted to the Defense Office of Pre-Publication and Security Review, DAAWSAP. It took 7 months for DAAWSAP to go through this document, including that particular paragraph. And, DAAWSAP essentially put their stamp of approval on it after the book had, the manuscript had gone out to Defense Intelligence Agency reviewers, Department of Homeland Security reviewers, and other agency reviewers. So bottom line, when you submit a manuscript to DAAWSAP, is that the approval process basically generates a line in the sand beyond which it is not feasible to go. So that line in the sand that was part of the approval process that Lukatsky received is a line in the sand beyond which we cannot go.
I mean,
And
that's yeah, go ahead.
He went a long way down that path, and he's done his best to be as forthright as possible. But the realities of the national security state are that once DOPSR provides approval, it is not possible to go beyond that line in the sand without risks. And people are not prepared to take those risks.
It's a blockbuster line, James, and I'm sure if you don't read it carefully, you can blow right by it and miss it, but it's very carefully worded. He said as much as he could. I mean, we'd all like to know more about that, but I think the way he was able to get away with saying that much because he doesn't identify where the craft is or who possesses it or who was doing the test to get inside. Doesn't even name the people that he shared that information with. So I think he went as far as he could. He'd like to do more. We'd certainly like to publish more about it, but that's all we can do for now. Maybe somewhere down the road we can get more info out there.
Yeah, and I imagine you can't say too much more about it.
But it's confirmation from a guy who was in a position to know this is real. Yeah,
right. And so, Colm, was that information secondhand to you?
Secondhand in terms of
you heard it from Jim Lakatsky. You weren't.
Yes.
Okay, you weren't at the thing.
I was not at the meeting in Congress. And remember, this is couched in the context of 2011. It says specifically in the paragraph 2011, which is after the AAWSAP program was terminated.
Right.
So keep in mind, James, back in that time frame, is that they were trying to find a new home for AAWSAP. And they had gone around, you'll recall, as we've reported before, they went around knocking on doors. Bigelow Aerospace had modified its plant in order to receive certain materials, exotic sort of materials, metamaterials, the implication being some sort of crash recovery material. They had modified the plant as part of the contract. They expected to get it. They never did. But they went knocking on doors asking, where is this stuff? And that's when trouble really got going for AAWSAP. The door was slammed in their face. They're basically told it's none of their business. And the handwriting is on the wall. The beginning of the end had arrived. These guys were trying to track that stuff down. They thought it was real. And the door got slammed in their face.
So,
I mean, basically, I just add to that is that I think everybody who has looked into NISPOM and the national security directives governing how classified material is treated knows that waived unacknowledged special access programs have bigot lists. And bigot lists have a list of names that are associated with these programs. If you're not on the bigot list, you're not going to have access to that information.
Not even if you're a vice admiral, right?
Well, there's a famous story where one of our colleagues, was part of the CIA remote viewing program back in the 70s. Back in the 70s, parts of that were actually a special access program. And, we've heard the story of the Attorney General came knocking on the door looking for information on this program that he'd heard about. And he was just turned away. The door was slammed in his face. Here we have the highest ranking member of the Department of Justice, basically having the door slammed in his face. Why? Because he was not on the bigot list. He was not on the list of names who had a need to know for a waived unacknowledged special access program. That's the way the system works.
Right. And is there a difference or a correlation between unacknowledged special access programs and the UFO legacy programs, or do the UFO legacy programs just fall into waived SAPs?
That I don't know.
So again, the UFO legacy programs are kind of like they're common language now. So when did you guys first run into the UFO legacy programs?
Well, for me, it was 1989.
Right.
chasing down stories of crashed saucers being tested in the Nevada desert. So it's been a while.
Colm.
These programs are part of the UFO lore. And so certainly when I joined the National Institute for Discovery Science in 1996, these programs were part of, the remit to start looking into and to see if there was any way of researching into those topics. But, remember, National Institute for Discovery Science was not a classified program. So we were sort of digging from the outside. But I guess my introduction to these so-called legacy programs was 1996.
And how close have you ever gotten to one?
I can't talk about that. I was indoctrinated into TSSCI clearances, into a couple of different programs. I signed documentation that was very clear. And, as I cited previously, the NISPOM manual, which runs to hundreds of pages, defines pretty clearly the do's and don'ts of handling classified information.
And James, you'd like to say to Colm, as the ufology world, come on, spill the beans. We don't care if you go to prison. Take one for the team here, right?
Well, no, I know it's not as simple as that, but at the same time, how far can we toe the line, right? We have, I know David Grush, whistleblower, testified in front of Congress. He was able to speak about a lot. He put in his complaint. He went through DAAWSAP. So he's able to say what he's able to say.
And you notice he didn't go very far beyond what was approved by DAAWSAP.
But he did compared to what's been said in the past by individuals in his capacity.
Absolutely.
He went pretty. It's amazing that he said what he said publicly.
Yeah.
Agreed.
And then you have somebody behind him like Carl Nell, on the record saying some kind of validating what David Grush's claims are being made.
We certainly hope that somebody of integrity takes over that job at Arrow and is willing to follow the evidence where it leads. Someone of integrity who really wants to get to the bottom of this, as opposed to trying to do the Robertson panel and Project Blue Book all over again and explain it away and make it go away.
Do you know who may be any candidates for that position?
I think I've heard some of the same names you've probably heard, James. I have no idea how valid those names are.
Right.
Some of the names we've heard are pretty good if that ends up that. I have a hard time believing that the Department of Defense is going to put somebody in there who's an honest investigator and really wants to truly get to the bottom of this. That's not what we're seeing from them now. Every indication coming out of back east is we're going to put a lid on this. We're going to clamp down, use national security to deny information from the public and from Congress, and then we're going to explain away as many as we can and put out as little information as possible.
Right. So guys, we only have a few minutes left, so I want to do something like a rapid fire. Column, either during AAWSAP or any other investigation that you've done, and especially in dealing with read-ins and access to insiders. Have you ever come across Starfish Prime?
I've heard the name.
Yeah, so it's a discussion about an alleged event in the 1960s where we were doing high altitude nuclear detonations, and there was a retrieval of an object of unknown origin.
Yeah, I've heard the name, but I have not been exposed to that program.
Okay. How about, this comes up sometimes is UFO baiting, coaxing or, trying to lure UFOs in, either with, nuclear technology, assets, and or individuals of interest. Did AAWSAP ever deal with that?
Well, I guess, peripherally, if you go all the way back to, Skinwalker Ranch, there were attempts to lure the UFO in regarding digging on the property, altering the topography, altering the terrain, and in a controlled way, and then observing the uptick in UFO activity. I mean, there's various ways of approaching this, but you know, I think you're getting into arcana that are, you know, it's certainly not my direct experience in terms of utilizing individuals.
I am aware of something to do along those lines, James, that there was an experiment that was conducted by moving nuclear assets and then watching to see who came chasing after it. I had been told that happened 18 out of 18 times, but I have no way to verify that information.
Right. And here, what else do we have here? Because I know you guys got it. Not too much time left. You know, in even the book, there's a term that comes up, and that is human interface. So how is human interface involved with AAWSAP?
Well, human interface is different, obviously, from human effects. So from a human interface perspective, you're looking at everything from what an advanced cockpit might look like in the future to how humans could interface with UFO technology, and that has, you know, ramifications in the consciousness arena. It also has ramifications in the technological arena.
Right. And I know this is not technically yours per se, right? But you had this, I don't know if the audience can see this, slide 9. You guys, I don't know if you've ever seen that column. There's cognitive human interface. What is that?
Well, it goes back to I guess that the broad rubric of accessing UFO technology through consciousness modalities, and that would include technologies like remote viewing. It would include other technologies of remote influencing. It's a broad, from the AAWSAP perspective, it was considered a broad department under the rubric of UFOs and consciousness. We did, as Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, did propose to DIA that we conduct multiple remote viewing programs within the AAWSAP category, but Defense Intelligence Agency turned it down, and they basically said that it would involve too much resource, too many people, and so what they did allow was small pilot projects that involve remote viewing as they pertain to the UFO project. And we've already reported in Skinwalkers and the Pentagon some of what Joe McMonigal, for example, did in the remote viewing regarding Skinwalker Ranch. So there were very small pilot attempts made during the AAWSAP program.
Okay, and I'm going to bring up some names, and Colm, you can tell me if they sound familiar. Jeffrey Griffith, Mary Elliott, TRW.
I'm not going to comment on that
because I'm not saying anything. I'm not attaching a name to it. I'm just saying, you know.
Well, I know where that is going, so I'm not at liberty to comment on that program.
Okay, but are you even able to say the name, or is it something where you can't even say the name of it?
I'm not at liberty to discuss that program, so I'm not. It's part of what I can't talk about.
George, can you tell me what I'm talking about?
No, not really. No.
You can't say the name?
I don't think I want to go there, not with Colm as part of the program, but we can talk about it off the air.
I'd love to do that. If you can stay after a few minutes or even another time. But that's, yeah, because that's of high interest. Does that have anything to do with David Grush coming out and anything that he discovered while he was doing his investigation for the UAP task force?
I think Dave did touch fist bumps with some of that information and some of those people. But you'd have to ask him that. He'd have to be the one to answer that. I just say this, James, at the end of this, Colm and I go way back to the Skinwalker Ranch days, and that ranch it is still a unique place in that, under one roof was all these strange phenomena that it seemed to be like a learning curve there. And it's a microcosm of the bigger UFO UAP mystery, and that it has so many different faces and different aspects, and it's trying to almost teach us that reality isn't what it used to be, that it's way more complicated than merely space aliens and flying saucers visiting us from other planets. We're not going to figure this stuff out by just studying lights in the sky and radar returns. You have to do boots on the ground, interact with people who've had close encounters, and listen to their stories and listen to the effects that these things have had on their lives. And you have to follow the evidence where it leads. AAWSAP is a great model for what a UFO investigation should be. We lay it out in this book of the kinds of really solid information that were gathered as part of that investigation and that program. And I would hope that it could be a model for what Arrow could eventually become, that they'd be honest brokers of information, follow the evidence where it leads, and not be deterred because things get a little too weird.
And it did, in the aspect of recovered technology, has there ever been a suggestion that the recovered technology also has a component that interacts with consciousness?
I'm not aware of that. I'm not able to talk about that either.
I can say this is that the recovered technology crash retrieval programs are real, that there is material, there are craft, intact craft and bits and pieces that have been stashed in these legacy programs and special access programs in private contractor hangars. This stuff is real. Whether we're ever going to get to see it or not, I know we have high expectations and we think we've seen some progress in that regard. What's happening right now in DC at the Pentagon is clear evidence that the closer you get to the secrets, the harder the pushback becomes. We were really all confident that disclosure might get somewhere, that we might actually learn something in the next couple of years. Looks to me like the keepers of the secrets have really battened down the hatches and are pushing back. And I'm not very encouraged by where this is leading right now.
Okay. And just really quickly, Colm, I'd like to get your word on it. Non-human biologics. How do you interpret that? Because, David Grush said that we had recovered vehicles of unknown
I think he explained what non-human biologics were. He referenced pilots of alleged craft.
Yeah. Well, because your background especially is interesting in this regard.
Yeah, it is a very interesting part of this. And, I think, as George said, the hope is that as we go into the future, that there will be some sort of infrastructure where people who have knowledge do have the capability of coming forward. Because I can tell you right now, there is no such infrastructure. There's a lot of talk in Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. is extremely good at talking. But in terms of action, each individual intelligence agency has its own set of rules and regulations, has its own set of the way things are done. And sort of talk about amnesty and on this kind of thing is just talk. And sort of the realities are that people's lives can be affected by this. So infrastructure is very important as we go forward. And, I joined George in thinking that, we hope that the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office will actually generate something that is tangible. But, time will tell.
If I were a whistleblower, James, and I had information of a very sensitive nature, still classified, Would I go to the Arrow website and log in and try to share it through that? Hell no. They'd have to be out of their mind. You're putting your life on the line because you're going to trust Arrow. I wouldn't, and I don't think others do right now. They're going through that right now. There's no way in hell they're going to use that portal as a way to get access to really sensitive information about these legacy programs.
Yeah, and I got to cut you guys loose in a second. I know you got to go, but just real quick, Kit Green, or let me start by saying in Forbidden Science Volume 5, Jacques Vallée is talking about how Colm, you had a meeting or a conversation with Dr. Kit Green, that Dr. Kit Green was brought in 2 times to see occupants or entities, or, is there anything you can say to that effect? Does that sound familiar?
Well, I know there's been a lot of press speculation about that particular memo or that particular email, but to my knowledge, Dr. Green has walked back a lot of what was in that, and I think it might have been a set of misunderstandings originally, because as far as I know, he has walked back a lot of what's in that email.
Well, what he walked back was that he thought the Santilli film could have been real. What he didn't walk back is that why was he brought into the Pentagon and being shown alleged autopsy things, and Vallée hints at saying, Kit believed at first it was disinformation, but then because of his skepticism, maybe he wasn't invited back because of his skepticism of what he was being shown.
Yeah, I guess what I would do is I would contact Kit Green about that.
Okay. And one more thing is, Jim Lukatsky brought it up, and he pointed to you specifically, Colm, is the human potential. He said that's something that you would be, that very well. Human potential, UAP consciousness. What is that? How does that register to you?
I guess the only interpretation of what you've just said is that there's a real sort of ongoing push in the academic community out in the United States. People like Jeffrey Kripal and others that are sort of starting to look at, Bernardo Kastrup is another example.
Yeah.
Edward Kelly, Robert Lanza, Donald Hoffman. I mean, there's a whole slew of people that are kind of starting to look at human perception as being the sort of the membrane or the interface in terms of interacting with UFOs. So, this is a pretty long conversation that we would need to get into, but the bottom line is that human perception itself could be the issue with respect to our inability to come to grips with the UFO phenomenon.
Yeah, and I just real quick, other names we can put in there are Dr. Gary Nolan, Dr. Kit Green. The study they did with caudate pertainment, which I was able to publish the original article on, is the basal ganglia area where such experiencers were seeing anomalous encounters, but also those same individuals happen to have a proclivity to remote viewing and high levels of intuition and intelligence.
Yeah, I'm aware of that study. It was a really interesting study. I've got to go.
Yep, James, me too.
Somebody's calling me. I've got to go.
Yeah, well, thank you
James,
so much,
thanks.
guys. I greatly appreciate your time, and I hope to speak again soon.
We'll do it again. Thanks.
All right, take care.
You.